Welcome to the Fabric Spotlight, the series of talks that we have on all things cloud infrastructure with various industry luminaries. Today, it's my pleasure to have a chat with Schwark Satyavolu, General Manager at Trinity Ventures. Welcome, Schwark.
Thank you very much, Van.
Before we get rolling hot and heavy, just kind of a lightweight intro of how you got here. We know each other for a couple of decades now, from early days. That's right. But maybe catch up our friends here on your journey.
Sure. As you know, I've spent most of my time on the entrepreneurial seat. I've very recently, in fact, moved into the venture capital side. I am an engineer by background. Started my career actually at Microsoft up in Seattle, and somewhat unwillingly actually moved down to the Bay Area to start my first company, which is when I first met you back in '99, I think it was.
Yeah, that's right.
And where you were kind enough to actually be one of my angel investors in Yodlee. And we ultimately took that company public, and then I left to start another company called True Access. This one I sold to MasterCard, and then I spent some time in MasterCard, and then again at LifeLock before I came into venture capital.
Oh, LifeLock. Okay, that's they're advertising a lot.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so at Trinity, is there an area of focus that you invest in, or is it broader?
Yeah, so I think at Trinity, the key areas I focus in are fintech, which is where I spend probably the bulk of my energies.
I see.
Both enterprise, or actually mostly enterprise and consumer fintech, as well as in DevOps and security. So those are my areas of focus.
Okay, interesting. DevOps, that's interesting. So you have been more recent addition to Trinity, but you have spent some time there. So you kind of give us how Trinity has had quite a bit of success. How do you go about finding and building those companies?
Sure. So I think Trinity actually was one of my investors in my second company, and that's how I actually first met them. And then I served as an outside board member with Ajay, one of my partners, on one of his companies before I ever came here as a general partner. So I've actually had a long relationship with the firm. One of the things that's unique about Trinity is that it actually has quite a bit of operational folks as GPs. So my partner Ajay actually started his own company, took it from a living room to public markets. My partner Karan actually was in sales and actually built large sales organizations. So we all come with a lot of operational background that actually ends up giving us a lot of edge in talking to the folks that we hope to serve. I personally would always like to kind of go to a firm where I have the kind of board experience that I wanted to have as an entrepreneur, and that's what we all aspire to give. And so when we look at opportunities or looking at companies, we've tended to form long-term relationships with our entrepreneurs. So quite a few of our entrepreneurs we've actually backed multiple times because these are long-standing relationships we've ended up building. Even first-time entrepreneurs that we've funded, oftentimes we've actually gotten to know them over a long period of time. So we got to know them as either portfolio company VPs or product managers and so on and so forth. So we've gotten to know them over a longer period of time.
Keep in touch.
Exactly. So, and then we have a very wide network of friends that have spent time with us, that actually know who we stand for.
I'm part of that circle.
That is exactly right. And they tend to kind of think of us when they find companies that are in our wheelhouse.
Excellent. So, the area of focus for Fabric is cloud and IoT infrastructure. So, in the general area of hybrid and multi-cloud, and other than fintech, you mentioned DevOps and security. What kind of innovation opportunities are there?
So I think the big innovation opportunities, if you talk to any of the big cloud providers, one of the core things that they'll tell you is that they've pretty much kind of saturated or kind of sucked up all of the, what I'll call the new company demand, right? So what I'll think of as Silicon Valley using the cloud, that's kind of the norm now. Everybody that's starting up in Silicon Valley is using the cloud. The big opportunity in cloud, I think, is what I call the traditional IT spend, which is all in data centers today. The bulk of it is still in the data centers. As big as cloud spend is, there's 10 times that in data centers. So moving more of that into the cloud world, I think, is the big opportunity.
So what is needed for that?
So that's a good question. Yeah. So that's actually what we've been breaking down to say, okay, what is necessary to get a Procter & Gamble or General Motors, all the what I'll call the old world industry that has large data center spends, to kind of move more of that onto the cloud. One of the things that we've come up with is this construct of governance, compliance, risk management, the kinds of stuff that comes as part of the fact that you control your data center. So when you control your data center, in a lot of ways, it was very slow. And the slowness is, on one hand, a negative, and that's actually part of the reason why they want to move to the cloud. Right. But that's a double-edged sword, which basically means that now suddenly you kind of reduce the cost of mobility, of actually getting stuff up and running to kind of move code into production. Suddenly the risks also kind of multiply. So how do you kind of create a risk management infrastructure that actually enables you to create visibility, control, governance, compliance, all the kinds of things that you almost took for granted or got for free because of the slowness of the entire system in the data center? How do you translate that and kind of overlay that on top of this system? Even simple things like risk management. Like, when you have a data center, you always had 3 different bandwidth providers. You actually ran one of those things at one point. So you actually end up creating a lot of different redundancies that you actually give a lot of control and risk management. Now, when you move to a cloud, you actually have single points of failure. Like when Amazon went down, Netflix and others went down for a long period of time. Those are things that might be okay for an internet company. But when you look into the old guard companies, they've generally kind of tried to diversify even the location of the data centers, the providers in each of those data centers, multiple layers, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of creating something that actually gives them the ability to kind of think of this more in a multi-cloud manner rather than as a single cloud infrastructure. Okay. And also the cost of movement seems like another area, right? Which is to take what has been architected to run in a data center and to move it into the cloud. Seems like it requires a substantial amount of reinvestment and re-architecture to kind of make possible. Is there ways you can actually do that and that can reduce the cost of actually moving stuff over? Are all things that we think could be opportunities. Again, we're continuing to meet companies and look at stuff to see if that thesis makes sense.
Okay, very interesting. So, particularly with respect to your area of focus, what is happening with the enterprise in that regard that you mentioned? How enterprises are thinking about cloud security?
Yeah.
Is that an impediment? I know that everybody says, oh, Amazon and Azure is more secure than enterprise data center. Maybe that goes, but are there other aspects of cloud security that people are worried about? In fact, I think JP Morgan says they are not going to move.
Yeah. So, yeah. The interesting thing is cloud security is definitely something that needs to be thought through, simply because, again, as I said, the fundamental architecture of how someone uses the cloud is fundamentally different than how you use the data center. So data center, there are gatekeepers, there are guards, if you may, that are effectively controlling the flow of information in and out of the system, which in a lot of ways is, funnily enough, the impetus for why people want to move to the cloud, because they don't like the slow control infrastructure that you have. But when you move to the cloud, suddenly anybody can spin up an entire instance, get something going, and actually have connectivity to all these different systems. They're heavily networked. There's multiple microservices. So suddenly you have thousands of solutions or microservices running in a system. So even knowing what's going on can be a substantial effort on its own.
Right.
And so I do think you need a new class of services to enable you to kind of stay on top of this stuff and to control the flow, to control just even what gets spun up, what actually gets done, and then look at different kinds of flows of information, how you protect all of that. So it does require a new class of solutions. And there are clearly, the old guard is effectively trying to create cloud versions of everything that they have. Right. But effectively, those are, I think, better done if they're rethought. So we just made an investment in a company called Voltex that is in edge security, perimeter security, like firewalling in cloud-enabled environments. So there are things like that we're looking at that can effectively help solve the problem with more first principles cloud enablement rather than kind of retrofitting or jerry-rigging, if you may, the more data center infrastructure for more cloud-based use cases.
So you mentioned DevOps.
Yeah.
what are the kinds of things that you're looking at there?
So in DevOps, what's interesting is you can see that there is an entire spectrum of companies. There are companies like Netflix that basically started using the cloud from the get-go and are literally known for, at this point, doing releases many times an hour to kind of reduce their and being able to do that safely, do that in a way that scales. You don't actually see a lot of downtime because the release is going bad. Because they've figured out a mechanism to actually deploy code in a couple of minutes effectively, and do it many times a day, and do it in a sustainable manner. The bulk of software, however, is nowhere close to that. And I'd say that what I see as a long-term transition is that the rest of the industry will start to move towards that Netflix model, because we are getting to a point where we need to kind of innovate faster just to keep up. And so being able to kind of increase the velocity of development is becoming more and more of a priority for a larger and larger portion of the market. And each of them has different kinds of issues. One of them, it might simply be pipelines or development pipelines. How do you kind of orchestrate and implement some of them? Some of them might be simply doing things like these canary builds, like how do I manage just running a test version of a small portion versus others? And for yet others, that's right.
Traffic splitting.
That's right. And so then you have, other kinds of folks that are dealing with more fundamental problems, which is their software is still very, very monolithic. So irrespective of what kind of pipelines you use or whatever else, the risk is simply too high to actually release that so frequently, because you cannot even test these things in any reasonable way, because so they're focused more on splitting things up. So one of the things that we're also quite interested in is like, what does it take to kind of take a monolithic system and move into a microservices world? And when you do that, what are the first set of problems you need to solve as a corporation, and how do you simplify that market entry? So there's a lot of Envoy-based solutions that are being created to enable the management of this explosion of microservices when you split an application up into many of them. And so we've been looking at a lot of those kinds of solutions to see what are the kinds of things that people could be using to enable them to kind of do that more easily.
Right. So one of the things that Netflix pioneered is this concept of microservices that you mentioned. They have like hundreds of them. So in that scenario, there's a lot of complexity, right? Particularly if you are used to a monolithic application, you are going into that now kind of like. So in that scenario, are there like, have you been thinking about performance issues, security issues that are specific to that kind of environment?
Absolutely. I think in a lot of ways, as you kind of go into these environments, the kind of problems that you run into can sometimes be new problems that you don't. So for example, when you have so many microservices, even how do you kind of manage discovery, like lookups, all these kinds of things. These are problems that don't exist in a world where those don't happen. So you do need to kind of come up with the right kind of mechanisms to manage all those things in a scalable way. You do also have to solve the traditional problems like security. There's possibly billing and what do you call anomaly detection, figuring out whether everything is actually working correctly, or something when something goes off kilter that you can actually detect it quickly. So all kinds of problems that are traditional also need to be solved here. What's interesting is when you look at things like security, one of the questions is also kind of figuring out who you sell to. So if you sell to what I think of as like cloud native providers, you actually can sell products that are primarily geared at solving this set of problems. But if you want to sell to what I think of as the bulk of the dollars, which is where all the dollars are being spent, I think that there probably is more of a need to sell a more hybrid solution where I don't have to use a different product line to solve my cloud problems, which is different than the product line I have to solve my data center problems, right? Because the largest spenders in IT actually have quite a big spend still in data centers while they're moving the stuff into the cloud. And so it is ideally easiest for them to adopt if you can actually take a single pane of glass or a single control plane, if you may, that can actually enable them to manage all of their infrastructure rather than have to solve a separate problem in the cloud and then use a separate infrastructure in the data center. Because over at least the next 5 to 10 years, probably even longer, we are still going to be in a world where a bulk of spend and a bulk of infrastructure is still running in data centers while things are moving into the cloud. And so trying to solve problem a little bit more holistically, at least right now our thinking is that will actually be a faster growth opportunity than something that serves cloud native specifically.
I see. Interesting. Very interesting. So I don't know whether this is your area or not, but lately, even in our recent event, we were talking about this a lot, about the edge.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that, and how is Trinity looking at it?
Sure. So I'm actually happen to be a mechanical engineer by background. So I've actually spent a lot of time looking at stuff in IoT, industrial IoT specifically, and so there's two kinds of edge we've looked at. One is this new some of the most advanced software development shops are actually moving some of their functionality out to the edge just for performance reasons. Like for example, Uber, the little widget that actually shows you where your car is coming from actually runs at the edge. It actually doesn't have to go all the way back to the data center to kind of do this. So there are things like that are now being done where certain pieces of functionality that makes sense to push out to the edge are actually being pushed out to the edge. So that's nothing to do with the IoT. That's nothing to do with but the edge in that scenario is also defined very differently, right? But the edge in that scenario is typically what I think of as like the CDN edges rather than the true edge, if you may, which actually is the very end computing device. But as you kind of think about the advent of 5G, I think the definition of edge could actually become a little bit more the end device. We'll wait to see exactly what kinds of things will actually move to the edge in those kind of scenarios.
Or could be a 5G cell.
That's
location.
right. But the thing that the edge, as defined today, that seems like it's has a bunch of innovation happening right now, is the industrial IoT space, where the sheer volume of information simply makes it really hard to kind of push all that stuff out to a cloud or even a data center to process. And so pushing processing, pushing inference, AI is another area where we're seeing a lot of edge compute. Pushing compute down to the edge makes a lot more sense, where either latency is very, very important, or the volumes are very, very large. Industrial IoT is where volumes are very, very large, and cameras and visual stuff and edge inference is actually happening a lot more because latency is more important in some visual applications. So those are some of the areas where we're seeing a lot of edge compute stuff. And the thing with industrial IoT is that's a big opportunity. There's a lot of early adopters that are starting to adopt it. But one of the things that we see as we talk to and scan what I think of as the CIOs of a lot of these industrial players that are actually trying to look at these solutions, it's still in the very early days of what I think of as prototyping, getting familiar with what it is. The scale spend, I think, is still a few years away. So one of the 4 core questions we are thinking about is like, what is the right timing to be investing in this space? Because you don't want to be in a company that has revenue scale that's 10 years away. If it's 4 or 5 years away, that's perfect for an early stage investor for us, right? So that's kind of one of the things we're looking at.
That's very interesting. So we have several companies, and they are looking at different stages of investment. So what's in your sweet spot? What do you see as people should come and talk to you?
So our bread and butter is Series A and Series B. So that's typically where we invest in most companies, regardless of which areas they are in. Some of the areas which we feel like the timing might be a little bit farther out than nearer in, we tend to also look at some seed bets, where we'll actually do some seed bets because we think the timing might be a longer term timing. So, and very early bet actually is a better bet than a slightly later stage bet. And so some areas we actually do look at some seed bets as well. But the bread and butter of what Trinity does is Series A's and Series B's, and we tend to lead the rounds that we do.
I see. So are you doing anything with respect to blockchain, which may be kind of like in the security space? Yeah,
so in fact, it's also a lot in the fintech space. So I actually spend a lot of time. That's right. Yeah. So I've spent quite a bit of time in the blockchain space. For good or bad, I would count myself as one of the blockchains, or I would say crypto skeptics. So I've kind of stayed away, even though I've looked at a lot of stuff in all through even the heydays of cryptocurrencies. We actually ended up not making any significant bets. That said, I'm a big believer that the blockchain is a fundamentally interesting technology platform that could make some things possible that weren't possible in the past, that could fundamentally change how things could be done. That said, we are also very, very kind of high bar, if you may, and I would say that I've not really seen too many things that can actually truly use the blockchain to do things that were not possible before. The vast majority of the blockchain stuff we see, I would think you could run off of an Oracle database just fine, and it would not really make that much of a difference.
Blockchain washed.
That's right, right? That said, the one bet we have made in that space is a company called Tori, which actually is trying to take ticketing and put it on the blockchain. And the thesis there is that we actually believe that the things that the blockchain is most interesting for are places where the asset itself is a digitally native asset. So whatever you're putting on the blockchain was created in the digital world somehow, right? It is not a bridge to something in the real world. And second, that it actually benefits from some of the core properties of the blockchain, which is that it's a public ledger that actually can keep track of all the transactions and the exchanges of those assets. So there are a few areas where that's really, really impactful. Tickets happen to be one of those things which are technically just digital assets. The paper tickets we have are ultimately still being scanned by a digital reader. Right. So the actual physical thing is almost like a physical artifact. The core asset is actually a digital asset. This is the idea of the ticket. But much more importantly, the tickets, multiple transactions are actually quite valuable that are not captured today. So Ticketmaster is issuing all the tickets, but StubHub is making a lot of the revenue, because the secondary and tertiary transactions that happen with the tickets changing world is not being captured, and it's not impossible to capture in today's world. So if you actually issued your tickets on the blockchain and you're able to put a smart contract for every transaction that happens, you can now actually monetize through any party. So it actually leverages the properties of a blockchain in a way that does not, that really cannot be solved any other way. So there are applications, we believe, that will truly kind of revolutionize how we think about certain spaces and certain businesses. And so we're really looking for that subset of things that are digital native assets that can somehow leverage the public transactional ledger property of the blockchain in some game-changing way.
I see. And that's starting to gather steam?
It is still somewhat slim pickings, I should say. It's there's a lot of stuff happening clearly, but it is. But I do think what's interesting is one of the limitations of the blockchain has always been its transaction velocity, and so you couldn't do things that were really high velocity things on the blockchain in the past. So one of the areas that I think is interesting is there's a lot of work going on in just trying to make that solve what I think of as more of like an infrastructure problem.
Hyperledger kind of thing.
That's right. Like EOS is doing some stuff, and there's like a bunch of stuff that's happening that I think could be interesting. What I think could make all of that even more interesting if there were killer apps that became more apparent. And I believe today we're doing a lot of work on infrastructure, but we are still lacking a lot of killer apps. I think Tori is one of the few that I've seen that I thought was very interesting in terms of a killer app that is built.
And in the fintech world, there are a few like Ripple and all of that.
That's right. So I think Ripple is trying to do transfers. Again, the question is really more around like what problem are you solving? What are the alternative ways of solving those problems? And does the blockchain truly kind of give you the benefit? One of the properties of the blockchain, at least as in a very pure way, is that it's very decentralized and there's multiple players, and that governance is through the algorithm and so on and so forth. Financial services, funnily enough, it actually doesn't like that very much, right? That's actually not a feature, it's almost a bug in financial services. And so creating more centralized versions of blockchains actually is probably the real opportunity in financial services.
Blockchains.
That's right, and more private blockchains, more centralized blockchains. JPM came up with their own. I invested in another company called Baton Systems. That's actually
Baton,
so they did. They are also moving money between banks, but again, it's a closed system rather than an open system, which actually happens to be a feature. Like that's actually what these folks want in order to be able to leverage them.
Keep that in mind. So that kind of like concludes our regularly scheduled programming. But I think you have been an entrepreneur and you are now on the investment side. Any general tips for the audience out there, the entrepreneurial audience, on how they should approach coming to people like you and asking for investment? What grabs your attention?
So I think with any kind of reach out to from an entrepreneur to an investor, it's more about trying to find the right entrepreneur, right investor for the right entrepreneur. When I first started raising money, it was all about brand name of firms. So I just went and pitched all the big name firms. We were lucky enough to have Sequoia and Excel invest in our company, but I was not, to be honest, educated enough to figure out how to pick my investors or where to go talk to, and even know who I should go pitch. I'd say today's entrepreneurs are much better educated than I was 25 years ago. But I think fundamentally the thing that makes it most interesting is if you know who the right investors are that would understand what you're trying to do. There are investors that like blockchain, there are investors that don't like blockchain. There's investors that believe very strongly that IoT or industrial IoT is happening right now, and there's others that believe there's a lot of opportunity, that it takes a little bit of time. And the good news with all our social media is a lot of us are putting our thoughts out in public relatively frequently. So knowing exactly who is probably going to be the best partner for you and how you think about the world is, in my mind, the best way to approach investors. And so my thoughts are all on my blogs and
so
my
they
podcast.
Should research what you have been saying.
And so there's always a much better fit when that comes together.
Very good, very nice. Okay, thank you very much for sharing those insights, Schwark. And stay tuned for another episode of the Fabric Spotlight.